Greetings, lovers of lore. Thank you for joining me for the next installment of the Brothers' War story. In the previous installment, Mishra and Ashnod had just stepped through a portal into the unknown, which ultimately led them to Phyrexia. And currently, we find them in Phyrexia. The Black Winds have whispered the name of this place to Mishra. And after surveying the land, they decide to head down to a large oil lake that is nearby. And inside this lake, there are dragon engines, 4 of them. They are large and impressive, but not quite like the one that they already have under their control. Mishra reached out and tried to control them, but Ashnod stopped him for a moment. What if they don't want to be controlled? And Mishra said, well, I guess you should prepare your staff and get ready to run then. At that point, they were noticed by the dragon engines and they converged on Mishra. Now, Mishra, to his credit, stood there calmly, holding out his hand as the dragon engines sniffed him like a dog. And then they laid down in servitude in a similar way to the dragon engine he already had under his control. And he realized and said aloud that he didn't need the stone to control them. They're obeying his thoughts. And ultimately, he was confused by this because the power to control them, as far as he was concerned, had to be coming from that magical power stone. After looking over the dragon engines, they considered the fact that they might actually be too big to take back through the portal. So they considered looking around for smaller dragon engines. But the conversation was interrupted by a loud gong sound. And the dragon engines reacted immediately. They turned to flee. And Mishra held them under his control, but he could feel that they were straining against it. And then there were 2 more loud gongs ringing out, sounds of destruction, and they were sounding closer. And at this point, 3 of the larger dragon engines just broke and fled back into the lake of oil. But the smallest dragon engine stayed laid on the ground, whining like a dog. And then out of the forest, a gigantic land ship construct comes barreling with massive scythe blades. It's a huge mouth of destruction, obliterating everything in its path. This, what was making the gong sound. Basically, every time it slams into one of these giant trees, a massive sound rings out. Atop the machine, a demon of metal and flesh, black skin. It was laughing fiendishly. Mishra turned to Ashnod. Run! They took off. Their skin was being torn by metal flowers and splashed with acid as they attempted to escape the giant construct. The dragon engine they left behind hadn't moved. It was torn apart by the giant metallic size when the construct slammed into it. Mishra and Ashnod managed to make it back to the portal and dove through. As soon as they did, Mishra started touching the glyph to close the portal, but it wouldn't close. So instead, he grabbed the power stone that was there, and it ended up burning his hand because the power stone was overloaded. As a result, Mishra dropped the stone, and it shattered into pieces. The portal winked out, and Ashnod was freaking out. She had not considered at all that the dragon engines might have another owner in that other world. And she turned to Mishra. That horrific demon, was that thing from your dreams? Mishra nodded reluctantly. The room was darkening now that the power stone had been taken out of the machine, and Mishra said, we got what we came for. Ashnod looked at him with disbelief. We came back with nothing, but Mishra wasn't paying any attention. He was already heading towards the cavern's entrance. And there, right out front of the cavern, clawing up out of the sand, were the 3 dragon engines that had retreated to the lake of oil. Ashnod was impressed. What now? Mishra says, another peace conference. Now back in the cave, unbeknownst to them, the portal flickered back into life. Just the tiniest bit, a few inches, but it was enough for a demonic hand to reach through, basically touching around, trying to find the edges and activate the glyphs around the portal's edge. Having no luck, the demonic hand quickly pulled back through the portal and the portal winked back shut. Peace talks were arranged between the Phylagi and the Yotians, and after a year of fighting, there was not exactly an offer of peace. It was more a cessation of activities so that peace could be discussed. Urza wants to establish permanent ornithopter outposts along the border, but unfortunately, his troops are spread thin, and as a result, he hesitates. He believes that the Philagi's demands are likely to be something they won't be able to agree to. Kayla, on her part, is unwilling to surrender the sword marches, but they ultimately agree to meet with the Phylagi, and the meeting will take place in the city of Krug. So, they went ahead and cleaned the city of all the anti-Phylagi graffiti that was scrawled all over the walls. All of the troops were drilled and prepared for the arrival. Urza personally interviewed the pilots so that he could learn their feelings towards the Phylagi, and as a result, he replaced 3 of them. Tanos was confused by the whole thing. He knew that Urza believed the negotiations would fail, so he asked, "Why are we doing this?" And Urza explained to him that even being able to talk without bloodshed is progress. But Tanos wasn't convinced. He believed that ultimately, Urza just wanted to see his brother Mishra. The day of the peace talks arrived, and the scouts reported that the Phylagi were at the gates. They had brought the giant dragon engine. It was pulling a great wain behind it, a massive wagon. Urza already knew about their arrival, as he had had them secretly tailed by Ornithopter. There was also reports of Phylagi massing along the border. 3 flights of Ornithopters were reassigned to watch. Tanos was impressed by the Thran wagon that they had brought with them. It was a towering 4-story behemoth covered in catapults, small ballista. Now, these were all wrapped up in tarps, but Tanos had a keen eye and could figure out what they were. When the wagon pulled up, Mishra and Ashnod stepped out. Mishra was bedecked in finery that made him look like a resplendent desert prince, and he waved to the assembled people who had gathered to see what was going on. Diplomatic protocol dictated that this should be an equal meeting. And since there was no Kadir and it was just Mishra, there would also be no Kayla, and instead just Urza and Tanos would go and meet with Mishra and Ashnod. Now, Urza was stiff at this meeting, but did issue a formal welcome to Krug. Mishra, for his part, is making big, sweeping gestures. He is playing it up for the crowd while also talking to Urza. And Urza inquires about the Kadir. Why is he not here? And Mishra says, "Don't be concerned that the Kadir is not here. I have the power to negotiate on his behalf. If you don't like it, we will leave." Now, Urza obviously wasn't able to take him up on this, because at this point, after all the gesturing that Mishra had done, making him look very friendly, it would make Urza look very cold to turn his brother away. So in one way, his hands were actually tied. And while they were having this interaction, Tanos and Ashnod basically were being ignored by their masters, so Ashnod winked over at Tanos. Urza attempted to talk about what had happened at Korlinda with the death of the warlord, but Mishra says that they'll talk about it later. After these formalities were taken care of, Urza introduced Mishra to Kayla, and Mishra praised Kayla's beauty heartily. Kayla was unprepared for him to be this eloquent. The peace talks went well. They were mainly formal demands, except for one. Mishra demanded Urza's power stone, and he spent his time talking with Kayla. Urza would have none of it. Mishra talked with Kayla, and Kayla spent her time arguing with Urza, trying to convince him that giving up his power stone was a small price to pay for peace. While all this is going on, Ashnod manages to talk straight-laced Tanos into playing hooky with her, and he gives her a tour of the facilities, and in exchange, she's going to show him how the dragon engine functions. Unfortunately, after the tour, they didn't have enough time to actually see the dragon engine, but that night they got together to drink some wine, and underneath it all, ultimately to feel each other out. So Tanos inquired about the relationship between Ashnod and Mishra. "Are you an item?" And Ashnod waved it away. "We did have a fling together, but with him, it was all about who could be in control. Ultimately, he cares far more about his engines." Tanos didn't miss that she had said engines plural and inquired further about it, but Ashnod just waved it away, saying that great wagon that was being dragged along counted as an engine. That's when Tanos has a terrible realization. Him being here with Ashnod is all part of a grander plan. And on his way to see Ashnod, he had run into Kayla, who had been acting suspicious. He had finally sorted out in the back of his mind what was going on and dashed off to find Urza. Sure enough, Urza was sleeping in his lab. He had been given drugged wine, so Tanos shook him awake, and the first thing Urza did was check for his stone, and it was gone. Urza bolted upright and ran out of the room. Tanos was not able to keep up with him. By the time Tanos had arrived, Urza had managed to regain his power stone. Mishra was standing there with his power stone in his fist, hastily half-dressed, and Kayla was there with nothing but a sheet wrapped around her. Now, after seeing that for a moment, his eyes were drawn right back to the brothers, where power was blazing from both of their stones. Now, Kayla had risen from the bed because obviously she's just seeking peace, and she steps towards the brothers as the power of their stones is reaching a higher intensity. And as she steps closer, Urza realizes she's going to step into the path of the power. So for the briefest moment, Urza drops his power stone. And as a result, Mishra's power blasts into him and slams his body across the room, throwing him into a cabinet. Mishra took the opportunity to run off while Urza laid breathing shallowly, staring open eyes, his legs trembling. Tanos cast about for a healing amulet, but it turned out it wouldn't be necessary. Urza's hand was around the Might Stone, which started to pulse, and then Urza's other hand reached out and grabbed the stone. His eyes closed and his breathing returned to normal. A moment later, his eyes snapped back open, blazing with rage. He leapt up. Kayla went to stop him, but he put up an arm to ward her off. Unfortunately, it was too fast and too hard, so he ended up knocking her over and she fell. Tanos reached out a restraining hand, but Urza was having none of it and smacked his hand away. Where is he? All Tanos had to do was glance at a door and Urza was gone, leaving a sobbing Kayla on the floor. I tried to do the best for my country, she said between sobbing gasps. Tanos ran out the door to follow after Urza and found Ashnod engaged fighting the guards. Tanos confronted her and she explains, I just want to leave, duckling. Tanos says, yeah, that's not happening. And Ashnod levels her staff at him and starts blasting him with that nausea magic. And then Tanos reaches into his pocket and that little snake that he used when he demonstrated his worth to Urza comes in handy again as he pulls it out of his pocket and flings it at Ashnod. Now, Ashnod clearly thinks this is some sort of dangerous magical device. So she pulls the staff upwards, pointing it towards this flying snake. And that's just enough distraction for Tanos to slam into her physically, knocking the wind out of her and stopping her staff from operating. After all was said and done, Ashnod looked at Tanos with new respect. She was genuinely impressed by what he had done. Mishra managed his escape without any problems whatsoever. The entire Phylagi contingent, in fact, escaped without a trace, unless you consider the fact that a sunken ferry was found after they were long gone. So Urza was completely unable to handle this scenario. As a result, he joined the Ornithopter scout squads that were being sent out hunting for Mishra and the Phylagi. And there were rumors flying that the Phylagi and Mishra hadn't actually escaped. They were hiding out in the city somewhere. There were rumors they were long gone. But regardless, Urza never came back. This went on for months. Rumors started to grow, and ultimately, people started to lose faith in Urza. And 4 months after the incident where Mishra fled into the night, Tanos realizes that Kayla is actually pregnant. And he sends word to Urza, and he gets no response back whatsoever. And that's when he realizes Urza's definitely not coming back. And at this point, based on the time frame of when Kayla got pregnant, that would have been around the exact same time that Mishra was there for the peace meetings. So Kayla might be carrying Mishra's child. Ashnod was kept as a prisoner, and Tanos managed to convince Kayla that he wanted to interrogate her about the magical staff that she possessed. But ultimately, Tanos wanted to make sure as well that Ashnod did not fall into the hands of the Queen's questioners. So they spend a considerable amount of time discussing different things, their different moralities, and basically Ashnod thinks that Tanos is pretty naive. They talk about the way that her staff is constructed and how it works on living nerves. And Ashnod points out that since Tanos is only ever willing to dissect dead creatures, he'll never really understand the way that living beings function, and as a result, his magic will never be on the level that hers is because she's willing to take that extra step. Now, Tanos does also acquire useful information in terms of the interrogation, as Ashnod does admit that Mishra may not actually really have a plan, but will capitalize on what's going on and something big will happen. And she also explained how she was able to get her magic staff inside and use it like she did. Basically, she came in with part of it as her walking staff, but then she had the gold wire for the staff sewn into her dress, and the power stones required were actually little fragments in her earrings. At the end of a long sequence of interrogations, she ends up giving him a kiss and thanks him for saving her from torture. She's very aware that because of his kind nature, she's been spared that. All in all, it took 6 months until one evening there was finally a sign of Urza's brother. Mishra's war machine was spotted. Urza ignored his captain's concerns when he rightfully brought up that it was evening and it would be dangerous to investigate at night. Urza ignored Sherman's concerns completely and demanded that the ornithopters be immediately readied for flight and loaded up with explosives. So, 10 minutes later, 6 ornithopters were ready to go, including Urza's bigger, beefier, fully loaded, basically twice the size of the other ornithopters with twice the payload as well. So, these 6 ornithopters depart. They fly over to where the war machine is. They don't encounter any problems at all on the way, but Captain Sherman has some kind of feeling that he can't let go of, that something is wrong. But either way, the ornithopters split into 2 groups once they arrive at the war machine. There is a little encampment around it. So Sherman ends up leading 3 of the ornithopters in a diving run at them, basically getting ready to drop charges upon them. However, unfortunately, once he gets close enough, the gigantic war machine opens fire with tons of its weaponry. So there's bolts and ballista bolts flying through the air, and there are these big jagged things that are specifically designed to pierce the wings of ornithopters, and once they do, drag them to the ground. Mishra has armed his war machine well, and even worse than that, Sherman discovers that that encampment is completely empty. So he got lured down there for no reason. And as a further insult on top of that, it turned out that Mishra had actually developed something that allowed him to activate the war machine with proximity to somebody showing up nearby, as opposed to actually having people man it. So there's literally nobody there. The war machine just goes off whenever anyone gets too close. And so the captain has barely survived, as one of these giant ballista bolts has ripped into his wing, and he basically, as he's going down, pushes the charges out the side of the ornithopter because he knows he's going to make a massive crater if he lands with them. And he does it just in time. As the explosion happens off to the side, he lands down hard, breaking his leg, but he's luckier than the other 2 pilots because their ornithopters just boom, when they hit the ground, they're done for. So Sherman is the only one who survives that first wave, but there's still the other 3 ornithopters left. You have Urza and the other 2 pilots, but now they're banking in towards the war machine. And Sherman, with his broken leg, he's got a bit of wreckage. He's using it like a cane, and he's trying to wave up to Urza to say, hey, stop, this is a trap. But they just think he's a Phylagi from the encampment, so they basically ignore him and they fly in. And when they get close, again, the war machine opens fire. But Urza and one of the pilots manages to get away in this case. One of the other pilots isn't so lucky. He gets taken out. And then you've got Urza and the other pilot who are coming in to basically get ready to drop their charges. But Sherriman realizes at the last minute that it's going to be a disaster if they do, because he's actually incredibly perceptive. Turns out he's right. The other pilot that's not Urza drops his charges down on the war machine, and Mishra had planned for this perfectly, because when those charges hit Mishra's war machine, it detonated into this massive blast that incinerated the pilot that had just dropped his charges and lit up the wings of Urza's special ornithopter, so it's basically coming crashing down, and Urza is able to bail out at the last moment, but he's looking at a very long walk back to town with Sherriman with his broken leg, and he looks up into the night sky and asks himself, why did Mishra play such an expensive trick? All right, that ends this installment of the Brothers War lore. I hope you've been enjoying the story. Now, if you really like what we're doing here, you can support us on Patreon or by joining the channel membership. And come on back for the next installment. It just gets crazier from here. Thanks for coming by. And remember, my friends, lore is life.